Hey guys, this is Vinny. In today's video, we'll talk about how to put together an underwater photography system centered around either a compact camera or a mirrorless camera. The first thing you need obviously is a camera. For most people, I'll recommend that they start out with a compact camera. For those of you who are really into photography or know that they really want to commit to the sport, you can also start right away with a mirrorless camera. For example, something like a Canon R7 or even a full frame R5 or an Olympus OM series camera. For now, I'm going to focus on building a camera system around a compact camera. But later in the video, I'll also talk about what is different if you do decide to use a mirrorless system to begin with. Now, let's start by discussing what features make a compact camera suitable for underwater photography. The first thing is you want a handy zoom size, something like a 3x, starting with a 24 or 28 mm on the wide end. You do not want a super telephoto or like a really long telephoto because that actually makes the housing a little bit harder to manage. And we'll talk more about that later. You can also read more about that in my article, which is linked to in the description below. But long and short, you want something like a 3x zoom starting at 24 or 28 mm. The second thing you want is a good macro mode. Macro photography is one of the more accessible parts of underwater photography in the sense that you don't need a lot of specialized equipment. It's easy to do even with a compact camera. And a good close-up capability is built into the camera, lets you take close-up shots of things like shrimps, nudibranchs, etc. without buying a whole lot of extra accessories. Another essential feature that your camera must have is a built-in flash. The reason is that this built-in flash is what triggers the external strobes of your system. Without this flash, you can't trigger the strobes. And it helps if you have a way of controlling that flash manually. Another feature that you should really look at is ease of manual controls. Underwater, you really don't want to be shooting in full auto. The auto modes of a camera are optimized for sort of land use. Underwater, they don't work so well. Even if your camera does have an underwater mode, trust me, it's not going to work as well as you choosing to override the controls and setting the exposure, etc. manually. So what do I mean by manual controls? Your camera should make it easy for you to set the aperture, shutter, and ISO, or exposure compensation, depending how you like to work. Ideally, you should also be able to select your focusing points by yourself, but sometimes can be limited, and there are workarounds to that. And the last thing is your camera must have a RAW mode. I think virtually all compact cameras these days do have them, but just double check and make sure. Once you've selected a camera, you need a housing for it. A housing is basically a waterproof case that lets you take the camera underwater. Now, what are some of the features that you should be looking at in a housing? First of all, it's the materials. A lot of housings are made of polycarbonate, aka plastic. And there's nothing wrong with plastic. It actually works quite well. It's relatively inexpensive. And they're fairly robust. I mean, obviously, if you drop it from 3-4 feet, it's not going to work. But you really shouldn't be doing that anyway, right? The downside of polycarbonate housings is that typically max out at about 30 or 40 meters of depth. Metal housings, on the other hand, let you go to 60, 70, even 100 meters. So if you're a tech diver who wants to take photos of deep wrecks or whatever, you need a metal housing. The second feature that you should be thinking about is access to controls. Not every housing lets you access all the controls of a camera. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Underwater, you don't need access to every little feature of your camera, right? You don't have the time to sit there and start playing around with 100 different settings. You really should be able to sort of change your exposure, change your focus point, and maybe your sort of focusing mode. That's about it. Or also ISO. And as long as your camera housing lets you do that, you're good to go. However, do check the housing and make sure that these controls are easily laid out. The ergonomics of a housing is something that a lot of people often ignore because they go, a housing is a housing. Trust me, that's not the case. A well laid out housing lets you sort of control all the buttons without necessarily needing to move your hands off it. On a housing with poor ergonomics, you will have to sort of move your hand around to sort of change different controls. And that's actually quite jarring. Not only does it take time, you have to actually look down at the housing to sort of see where the buttons are, and it's not so efficient. You can't do it quickly, and so when you're trying to shoot something like a fast-moving object, like a shark coming at you, or a manta ray sort of swimming by, and you're fiddling with the camera, you ain't gonna get the shot. So trust me, ergonomics of the housing matter a lot. This is something that sort of people often ignore, and it's worth paying a reasonable or a significant premium to get a housing with sort of well laid out controls that are easy to use and easy to operate. One other feature that can often be a lifesaver for the camera, not for you, but is existence of a vacuum control and moisture alarm. Moisture alarm is basically, as the name implies, it's an alarm that goes off when water enters your housing. By itself, it's not so useful. I mean, yeah, it tells you that your housing is flooded, and by the time you realize that, your camera is dead. What is more useful is a moisture alarm coupled with a vacuum seal. What a vacuum seal is basically, it's a small pump. It can be automatic, but in most cameras, you have to use a hand pump. And what you do is you sort of extract the air from inside your housing. Not all of it, just enough to create sort of a pressure imbalance. Once your housing is sort of in a state of semi-vacuum, there's a light that goes on saying that goes on. Typically, it's green. As long as the housing stays sealed and that semi-vacuum is maintained, that green light will stay on. If there's a leak in your housing, there's an O-ring failure or something has gone wrong, and air goes in, that light starts to flash. So the moment that light goes off, you know there's a problem with the vacuum integrity of your housing, and there's possibly a seal issue, and you shouldn't take that camera underwater. And one last thing you should also think about is the presence of a filter thread on the front of the camera. A filter thread will let you attach something like a macro lens or a wide-angle lens by screwing it directly onto the front. If you don't have the filter thread, you can still do it, but you need to buy another accessory, which is just one more thing to buy, one more thing to carry, one more thing adding weight. So the filter thread is something I do think is a very nice to have feature. So there you have it. Those are all the features of a housing. Now housings, generally you can buy OEM housings, and OEM housings are the ones made by the manufacturer itself, or you can buy third-party housings. Third-party housings would be ones that, for example, by Nauticam or Ikelite or Mirrorless or whoever. In general, OEM housings have the advantage of being relatively inexpensive, and they're also generally made of polycarbonate. Aftermarket housings can be a little bit more expensive, actually can be significantly more expensive, sometimes two to three times as expensive, for example, in the case of Nauticam. But what you do get there is a more robust construction. It might be a little bit smaller, so easier to carry. It might have better buoyancy characteristics in the water, and it'll typically have features like a moisture alarm and a vacuum seal, which the OEM housings don't have. So again, it depends. I mean, a lot of people, when they start out do end up buying just the OEM housing, and that's perfectly okay. However, once you start getting to a more expensive camera system, a third-party housing is actually well worth looking into. So now that you have a camera and a housing, you can actually go out and take photos right away. You have the bare essentials that you need for underwater photography. However, just by itself, you won't get results that are significantly better compared to shooting with like a GoPro or a mobile phone inside a housing. To get better quality shots, you need to get yourself lights. Now let's talk about some of the features of lights, aka strobes. The first one is power, which is literally how much power does the light put out. In other words, how powerful is the beam emitted by the strobe. The power is expressed by something called guide number. And without getting into the details of what a guide number means, basically you want a higher number is better. At minimum, you want a guide number of about 20, 22 for shooting with a compact camera. And once you start getting into sort of mirrorless cameras and shooting real wide angle, you need to get up to 30, 32 guide number or even higher. These are the two strobes I use. I've been using these Inon strobes since pretty much 2006. Fantastic bulletproof strobes, sadly discontinued. Inon, if you're watching them, I want these back in the market now. They're fantastic. I miss them. My life is incomplete without them. Inon, these strobes have a guide number of about 24, and sort of they work well for me even with a fisheye lens on a DSLR. These days I shoot with a Supe, and I'm also getting myself some Mirrorless strobes, which tend to be a bit more powerful and have a bunch of other features, which I'll also talk about soon. But the idea is get yourself a powerful strobe, guide number 20, 22 at minimum, and that's something that will stay with you for a long, long time. The next feature, along with sort of power, is also angle of coverage. You can have a really powerful strobe, but if it's got a very narrow beam, it's not going to do much for you. And in fact, many cheap manufacturers kind of sort of fudge their numbers that way. They say, oh, we have a really high guide number, except that the beam is so narrow that, it's effectively useless for underwater photography. Now, what is a good amount of angle of coverage that you want? at minimum 90 degrees, and with 90 degrees, you'll probably prefer to have two strobes. If you're starting out with a single strobe, I'd say get at least about something with 100, 110 degrees. And sometimes you may need to add a diffuser to the front of the strobe to get that 110 degrees, and that's perfectly okay. The next thing you care about is exposure mode. Contrary to popular belief, you don't necessarily want TTL for shooting underwater. Manual shooting works very well. Lighting underwater tends to be fairly consistent. So once you get an idea of sort of how much power you need for a given shot, you can pretty much replicate that from dive to dive to dive by making only small adjustments. And the benefit of shooting in manual exposure mode is it's very controlled. You know exactly where the light is going to go. Oftentimes, if your subject is positioned differently, or you have a small subject versus larger subject, that can throw off the TTL logic of your camera underwater. So if you want TTL, that's fine. TTL is only available with very specific sort of strobe and camera combinations. I wouldn't necessarily go out of my way to chase it right now. And two other things that you should think about is battery life. You want a strobe that can last you a full day of shooting. Let's say if you're doing 3 dives a day. How much that is depends on you. I'm not a very sort of like a high volume shooter. I get maybe, if I shoot 50, 100 photographs in a given day, that's a big thing. So for me, pretty much every strobe does last me a day. If you are a higher volume shooter, you probably want a strobe which has lithium-ion batteries as opposed to rechargeable AA, AAA batteries, because AA batteries tend to run out a bit faster. And linked to that is also the recycle time of the strobe. Sometimes once you fire a strobe, it can take 2-3 seconds to recharge. And imagine you're shooting something like a shark hunting or shark feeding on something. You take a shot, you wait 3 seconds, you take another shot, you wait 3 seconds, shark's gone, you missed your shot. Higher end strobes will tend to recycle faster. For example, the Super lets me shoot actually 10 shots a second without needing to stop. So it's got a near instantaneous recycle time. Again, in 19-20 years of underwater photography, I can think of maybe 3-4 occasions where I've sort of rapid fired a camera. So, nice to have, not essential. And the last question is, how many strobes should you start out with? Most complete underwater photography systems have 2 strobes. And 2 strobes are actually quite nice because they balance out the lighting. You can make one a bit brighter and one a bit less to sort of add shadows and depth to the image. But you can get started with one if you want. You are going to have some limitations in the type of photographs you can take, and that's fine. Start out with one strobe, learn to operate it, learn to aim it, learn to set the exposure, and once you have the hang of that, then you can add a second strobe. So now that you have a camera in a housing and a strobe, you need a way to sort of connect them together. The first part of that is a tray. A tray is nothing but a base for your housing. You can have a single handle tray, which is something like this. And typically here you would attach it with the handle on the left side sort of from your perspective, not from the viewer's perspective, but the shooter's perspective. Or you can get a double-handled tray. A double-handed tray sort of pretty much gives you handles on both sides. So what are the pros and cons of each? A single-handled tray is lighter, is cheaper, and it makes for a more compact setup, right? This is fairly compact and easy to carry. A double-handed tray is larger, it's heavier, and it's a bit bulkier, as you can see. However, if you're going to be using 2 strobes, you need double handles, so you can attach a strobe on each side. So while a single-handled tray might be something you can get away with initially, as you scale your system up, you'll probably want to add a second strobe, and at that point you'll wish you had a second handle. So how does your tray attach to the housing? Really simple. All trays have a little screw at the bottom, and there's a corresponding thread at the base of the housing. Again, virtually every housing has this threaded base, and you simply just place the housing on top and screw it in. Nicer trays will have 2 screws at the bottom, and if you can probably see it here, there's sort of 2. And by having 2 screws, what it does is it makes it a very secure fit. The housing is not going to spin on the tray, so it keeps it pretty secure. So now that you have your housing mounted on a tray, how do you actually attach a strobe to it? Well, almost every piece of underwater photography kit uses these standard 1-inch ball mounts that you can see here. You can see my strobe has it here. And basically what you do is you use clamps to attach the strobe to the tray. And the clamp is simply something like this. One end goes into one ball mount, and the other goes to the other ball mount, and so you can sort of attach it like this. But this is going to have some problems. Your strobe is going to be too close to your camera, and that's going to cause backscatter when you shoot the strobe. Ideally, for underwater photography, you want your strobe to be positioned away from the camera and pointing into subject at an angle. And how do you do that? By using arms. They will have a 1-inch ball on each side. One attaches to your tray, one attaches to your strobe. Now, strobe arms come in different sort of types. This is a simple sort of metal strobe arm. You also get what are called float arms. So this is a relatively inexpensive float arm. It's basically rigid plastic with a carbon fiber sheath. This is a slightly more expensive float arm. It's fully metal, provides greater buoyancy. And then you also get other variants of float arms, sort of where you have a regular metal arm, but you can add these sort of sleeves to it, sort of extra, depending on sort of your requirements. So I can adjust the flotation of this arm by adding more of these buoyancy collars, depending again on how many I need. For example, this arm has just one buoyancy collar. This arm has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 buoyancy collars. So this provides more buoyancy. So why do I need float arms? It depends on your camera setup. Polycarbonate housings tend to be more or less neutral in the water, so you don't really necessarily have a big need for flotation. But if you have metal housings are quite heavy and dense, so they tend to sink. So to offset that weight, you need buoyancy arms. So the buoyancy arms, sort of by adjusting the amount of collars in here, or by adjusting the size of the buoyancy arm itself, you can basically make your camera system more or less neutral, which actually makes it fairly easy to use. So even if it's actually quite large and bulky, in the water it actually doesn't weigh anything and makes your sort of photography a lot easier. While you can get the job done with one arm, you actually need two. And the reason for that is simple. With one arm, I have only a fixed sort of range where I can position my strobe. With two arms, I have a lot of flexibility. I can sort of extend it to move it, the strobe further out. I can bring it a lot closer. I can sort of position it, I can here or here. So the reticulation provided by the middle joint gives me a much larger range of positions where I can have my strobe. And that's really, really useful for underwater photography. So for each strobe, you will need 2 arms and 3 clamps. Why 3 clamps? One to attach it to the tray, one to join the 2 arms together, and one to attach it to the strobe. The next question is, what size arms do you need? Well, that really depends on what you're trying to shoot. If you're shooting macro, you can get away with very small arms. In fact, you don't need long arms because you're going to be keeping the strobes fairly close to the housing. So long arms just sort of kind of get in the way. However, that's only for macro. If you're planning on shooting wide angle or fish portraits or whatever, you'll need longer arms. For a compact camera, 2 6-inch arms generally work well enough. If you plan to get a mirrorless camera at some point and shoot with a fisheye, then you'll want at least 2 arms, each of which are about 8 to 12 inches long. Now, some housings actually have a cold shoe mount on top of them. A cold shoe mount is something similar to the hot shoe mount that cameras have for mounting a flash, but without any electrical circuitry. It's just basically a physical mount. What you can do is you can get one of these adapters. It's a cold shoe to ball head adapter, and you can basically affix it onto your cold shoe. And what that does is it gives you a 1-inch ball head on top of your housing for attaching sort of accessories. So you could, in theory, attach a strobe directly to it. You can attach an arm to it and a strobe on top of that, and therefore sort of not get by with not having a tray. However, I don't recommend this. The downside of doing this is that when you attach a strobe to this, that strobe is pretty much on axis and directly above the camera. So your lighting is going to be sort of straight down. That's not the best lighting for underwater photography. Ideally, you want your strobes to be off axis and coming in from an angle, pointing downwards, to simulate what sunlight looks like. So having this kind of limits your creativity with lighting. So now you have your camera, you have your housing, you have your tray, you have 2 arms, you have 3 clamps, and you have a strobe. You're good to go, right? Not quite. You still need to find a way to connect your strobe to the camera. So let me take a step back and explain how the strobe actually functions. Your camera has a built-in flash. When you take a picture and the flash goes off, it's that the light from the flash is what triggers your strobe. So you need to find a way to transmit the signal from your housing to the strobe off the flash going off. How do you do that? By using a fiber optic cable. A fiber optic cable connects, one end connects to your housing. Your housing will typically have ports in the front, so it plugs in there. And the other end basically connects to the strobe, and it screws in or plugs in as appropriate. So once it is connected, when you press your camera shutter, and when your camera's flash goes off, that signal gets sent to the strobe, and the strobe also fires automatically. Now at this point, it's worth noting that the different fiber optic cables have different connectors. The standard connector that you use is something like this, which is called the CNC connector. Most housings and most strobes use this connector. Some strobes, like the Inon, use a proprietary connector, which is not surprisingly called the Inon connector. Some housings, like the TG7 housings, use a flat plug. So in other words, when you purchase the fiber optic cable, make sure that the two ends match your strobe and your housing respectively. Now that you have everything you need to shoot underwater, what's kind of nice to have is a way of attaching it to yourself so you don't lose it. Now, how you attach it to yourself depends on sort of how heavy your rig is and sort of how experienced a diver you are. For really lightweight stuff like GoPros or something like that, you can just use like a retractable clip like this. Clip one into yourself, let it hang free, pull it out, shoot, and let it go. For slightly heavier gear, you can just use like a simple coil lanyard. This is a fairly lightweight one, and this is a slightly heavier weight one, right? So here just one end clips to you, one end clips to your kit, and sort of, you can hold it out and shoot, and then just drop it when you're not using it. But once you start building together a system which has lights and arms and all that other stuff, it's going to be quite heavy. A simple coil lanyard won't just sort of drag at the bottom. So there what helps is a lanyard with a clip. So here, when I'm shooting, I undo the clip and I just have a lanyard that opens up. When I'm not using it, I reattach the clip, and now it's hanging. Now it stays sort of firm. It doesn't sort of sag. The other part in terms of clips is actually carrying your camera. Camera gear tends to be quite heavy, especially once you add the arms and strobes, and even more so once you have two strobes and other accessories added on. So just holding it like that, you need really good sort of strong biceps to do so. I don't have such biceps, unfortunately. If you do, great. So what I like to do is have a carrying handle. So for my Nautica system, for example, I have these two clips attached to the housing. I have this little rope. I attach one end to one side, one end to the other side, and now I have a handle. So you even have the ports in the front and the arms, I can just carry it like this. It's a lot easier to carry it this way and sort of have it hanging below than sort of holding it up and doing like a high tension bicep curl for like 30 minutes or whatever. Okay, so now you bought your camera, you bought your housing, you bought your tray, you bought your arms, you bought your clamps, you bought your strobes, you bought your fiber optic cables. Surely that's the end, right? No more spending money, you can go take pictures. Well, yes and no. You're correct that you can go take pictures, but when it comes to spending money, not even close. This is underwater photography, my friends. There's always ways you can spend more money. And with that, let's talk about accessories. Okay, jokes apart, once you have your camera housing in a strobe, you can go out and take pictures. What accessories do, however, is increase the sort of scope of photography that you can do. For example, with my camera, with the Canon G7X Mark III, I have a decent but not great close-up mode. So what I can do with it is add a close-up diopter, which lets me focus closer. This lets me take pictures of things like nudibranchs and small shrimps and crabs that I would not otherwise be able to. Similarly, if I want to take a picture of something large, like maybe a whale shark or a manta, the typical angle of view of a compact camera would not let me do so. I'd have to go quite a bit back in order to take that shot. And as we know, the further you are from your subject, the worse your image gets. So in that case, what I might want to do is add a wide angle adapter to my camera system that increases the field of view of my camera. So that what it does is it lets me stay close to my subject and still shoot something that's larger. And how do I attach these accessories? If you go back to the start of this video, remember me talking about a filter thread at the front of your camera? That's where it comes handy. For example, this is a Sea Frogs housing for the Canon G7X Mark III. It has a 67mm filter thread in the front. This is a close-up diopter, which has a 67mm thread as well. So what I would do is I would just simply take it and I would screw it onto the front of my element of my camera, like so. And I'm good to go. So now I have a close-up adapter. Similarly, if I want to shoot wide angle, I can get a wide angle adapter. It's actually called a wet lens, a wide angle wet lens, and I can screw it on. In addition to wet lenses, there are other accessories you can attach to your system to increase its flexibility. A very common one is a focus lens. If you're shooting macro in low light, sometimes it becomes very difficult for your camera to focus. A focus lens actually makes it easier for your camera to acquire focus and also makes it easier for you to see what you're shooting. And a focus light, typically a popular place to mount it is on top of your camera housing, typically over the gold shoe. So again, you would use a clamp. You have a ball mount here and a ball mount there, and you attach it and then sort of you aim it at your subject and you're good to go. You can also use the top of your camera to have something like a GoPro. And sometimes you might want to add sort of other things. You might want to add a GoPro and a focus light, or maybe even a video light and stuff like that. And that's where something like this comes handy. It's a mounting tray. It basically attaches here, and it basically attaches here, and it gives you multiple mounting points on top of your camera. I have 1, 2, 3. So now I can attach a GoPro here, I can attach a focus light there, a video light there, or whatever I want, yeah? In other words, when it comes to scaling up your system and adding accessories, there are lots and lots of options out there. So far, we've been talking about building a system around a compact camera. A lot of what I've said there also applies towards building a system around a mirrorless camera. However, there's one fundamental difference that's worth noting. Before I get into that, some terminology. We've talked about the housing. The front of the housing through which the lens looks is called a port. On a housing for a compact camera, the port is fixed. It's usually a flat port, and that's because the compact camera itself has a fixed lens, which ranges from sort of moderate wide angle to moderate telephoto. And a flat lens is about the only port that can accommodate sort of that wide range of focal lengths. With mirrorless cameras, obviously the big advantage is that you can change the lens that you're shooting with. And this is where mirrorless housings are a little bit different. Mirrorless housings don't come with a port. You have to buy a port separately. When I shoot with a wide angle lens, something like a Panasonic 7-14, I use this port. It's a 7-inch wide dome port. It attaches here, and it lets me shoot wide angle quite well. If I want to shoot macro with a 60mm lens, I have to use a macro port. This is designed specifically for the 60mm lens and gives me the optimal performance with that particular lens. So obviously what you see here is that with a mirrorless housing, you need to buy multiple ports to match the lenses that you're going to use. Downside to that, more expense. So there you have it, folks. This is my recommendation on how to go about building an underwater photography system. Start with the camera, start with the housing, add a light, add a second light, and add accessories. However, the question I can see a lot of you asking is, yeah, Vinny, this is all good. Now tell us what camera to buy, what housing to buy, what strobe to buy. I am going to have specific recommendations on cameras, housings, and strobes, and you can see that in the article that I've linked to in the description below. I'm also going to shoot a video comparing the pros and cons of shooting with a compact camera versus a mirrorless camera. When that's done, I'll put the video link above and also put a description to the article matching that video in the description to this video below. So you can have a look at that when it's out as well. I will recommend a few things, however. When it comes to clamps, you don't have to spend a lot of money. You can buy whatever sort of inexpensive clamps that you can find at the shop. With arms, you have to obviously worry about the length of the arms that you need. We've talked about that when discussing strobe arms, that if for a typical compact camera, you want around 6 to 8 inch arms. If you plan to expand into mirrorless at some point down the road, consider getting 8 inch to 12 inch arms. Flotation is sort of a big question mark because you really won't know how much flotation you need until you actually take your camera in the water. So what I generally recommend is buying an arm system that lets you add floats later. And then you can add float collars as needed. And once you kind of get your camera sort of more or less balanced, then you can buy a more expensive flotation arm if you so desire. Like I said earlier, I've never felt the need to do that. I've shot for almost 20 years with the same sort of inexpensive float arms with sort of, just like styrofoam floats stuck in there. Okay, they're not really styrofoam, but they look like it. And it's worked well enough for me. So again, Strobes arms are not something we need to spend like $100, $150 per arm. Yeah, so that's another place we can save money. Where you definitely don't want to save money is on the strobes. Good strobes, like I said, are the single biggest thing towards taking good photographs. The money you spend on a good strobe is not something you will ever regret spending. So focus on the stuff that's going to last you a long time, which is your strobes and possibly also your camera and housing, and save money on things like arms and trays and clamps. Those are fairly fungible. You don't need to buy branded items for that. Start taking pictures. Once you come across the limitation of your system, at that point, then you ask yourself, what can I buy to overcome this limitation? Maybe it's a macro lens. Maybe it's a wide angle adapter. Maybe it's a focus light. Get that then. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this useful. If you did, please give us a like. Please give us a follow. If you have any questions, drop us a comment below, and I'm happy to answer it to the best of my abilities. Thank you, guys.